I think we'll crack on. There may be members of Parliament coming in, coming out. That's how it happens in this place. People on bill committees and so on. And that's before we get a pay rise. Which I don't intend to discuss at this meeting, please. Just to say this, now the third of part of this inquiry, which I think everybody in this room, I've recognised faces again and again, knows. And obviously this is... As I said, the third part of this inquiry, looking at, if you like, better outcomes, early diagnosis, issues like that. For the benefit of the witnesses today, we started the first one with patients, survivors and relatives and their experience of particular issues. The last one was with basically GPs, primary care and so on. We're hoping to have a fourth one, which is for the benefit of people, is on the 5th of September at 4 p.m, Committee Room 5, and that's with the NHS, if you like, NHS officials. And also for the benefit of everybody else, on the 25th of November is when we've booked to finally have a report, which we're hoping to be able to present to Health Minister there and have a reception, but there'll be invites and things, but if you could put those in your diary, it'd be really useful. We've got an hour. This place runs to time. I've got to be in the chamber at 12:15 promptly. And the basic format is, although it looks a bit officious in one sense, it is, to get things correctly. So what I'm going to ask the witnesses to do is, we'll go across the table. You can introduce yourself for the purpose of the record, although we've got your names and everything down. And then also, say, 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll come to various questions from myself, Lord Aberdare, and any MP who comes in. And then I always allow some time, because I'm such a fair and generous man, if anybody's got some comments from the audience, can pitch in towards the end, which I know some people already, as I said. And I'm grateful for that as well. So if we do start then, Sophie, if you want to introduce yourself and any comments you wish to make.
My name's Sophie Noble. I'm a clinical nurse specialist. I work in Leicester. And yes.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I don't know if this system's working.
Okay. My name's Sophie Noble. I'm a clinical nurse specialist, and I work in Leicester.
Right. Okay.
Satvinder Mudan, and I started life as an anthropologist and am now consultant at the Royal Marsden, and my main interest is pancreas cancer.
Right.
I'm Andrew Millar. I'm a gastroenterologist and hepatologist at the North Middlesex University Hospital, but also HPP Pathway Director for London Cancer.
I'm Angus Dalgleish. I'm a Professor of Oncology at St George's. I'm a medical oncologist by training with particular interest in immunotherapy, and I've had a long-standing research interest in pancreatic cancer.
Eric, if people do want to move round, I think that's absolutely fine.
That'd be easier, yeah.
Yeah, because people are they've got their backs to the audience.
And actually, usually this system's pretty good, but...
Yeah. And if speakers can speak up.
Can I start with the general point then, which has come up, and I'm sure you're well aware of it, we've been around like everybody else, and the key issue is always the failure in terms of early diagnosis with pancreatic cancer. Can I just ask you one by one, you want to make a comment on issues around that? Shall we start back to front? Angus?
I was going to suggest that Satvinder Mudan, we've been discussing this in great depth, and I think he should lead on this particular aspect.
Okay. If you could.
Yeah, I think probably what Gus means is that as the oncologists don't really do diagnostics, so we need to talk to the diagnostics people, which would be the gastroenterologist and myself. I think the issues around early diagnosis in pancreas cancer really centre around the presentation, which is often vague. So, minor symptoms, non-specific, that could have a number of diagnostic labels attached to them: epigastric pain, perhaps some backache, a bit of weight loss, loss of appetite, vague symptoms like that. I think that's the problem with early diagnosis, is to sense those symptoms, or first for the patient to be aware of the symptoms, and then for the medical people, the doctors, the GPs in particular, to sense the symptoms and say, okay, well, this might alert me to something more important that's going on, not necessarily pancreas cancer. And I would have thought that in the head of the GP, pancreas cancer is probably somewhere at the bottom of his list of things that he's thinking about. And the patient probably at that stage is not really emphasising the severity. They probably come along and say, well, actually, now you mention it, I have had a bit of back pain, or yeah, actually, I have lost a bit of weight. So I think it's getting that information, that data from the patient, which is very hard. And that's what makes early diagnosis in pancreatic cancer difficult. And there are no good screening tools as yet, either imaging or biochemical, that will carry, in sort of statistical language, a high sensitivity but also a high specificity. Otherwise, we're going to be in a sea of potential pancreatic cancers that we could never actually triage properly. So I think that the screening tests, not good. And that I think, is the problem in the early diagnostic pathway. You could extend it further back and say, okay, well, let's try and pick them up, before they actually become cancer. So we're looking at pre-cancer, because it's a long lead time to get pancreas cancer, long lead time, probably many years. But I think we're way off that type of diagnostic test as well, where we're looking for very, very early markers of cancerous change as opposed to cancer.
And why are we way off? Sorry.
Because to interrogate the pancreas, which is a remote organ, and get tissue from within the pancreas, or even things that might be being liberated by potential pancreatic cancer cells, that are destined to become cancer, is a way off, because the sensitivity of what we've got is, to look for those tiny things is poor, and we're not quite sure actually exactly what to look for unless you go and take tissue from within the pancreas, which is difficult, hazardous, costs a lot of money because of the location, because of the anatomic location of the pancreas.
Yeah. Sorry, Andrew, do you want to say something?
Yeah, I would like to. First of all, I think the problem is well evident that we have a major problem in diagnosing cancer, pancreatic cancer early, for all the points that have been made, but it's not an insoluble problem. I think what we need to do is look at a number of issues. First of all, the GP gatekeeper.
Yeah.
The GP has an absolute nightmare on his hands. He's going to see one or two pancreatic cancers over a few-year period, and he's meant to diagnose that cancer or pick it up and refer it the person for specialist diagnostic tests in a sea of patients with almost identical symptoms. So the first thing is to do, we've got to support our GPs better. There are lots of ways to do that, and one of the points that we're making now or later is that when we come up with ideas of how to make it better, we must research those with as much clinical rigour as we investigate a new medical drug or medical technique that we come up with. We shouldn't just introduce a wide range of different systems that might work without investigating them properly. The second issue is about finding patients who have got cancer earlier, who have already got that cancer. There is a myth that needs dispelling amongst the medical community that pancreatic cancer, if the patient has symptoms, you've already got someone who's not going to survive that condition. That's not true. We know that patients with very small cancers can survive. The mortality rate is more like 25% rather than 3% at 5 years. So diagnosing things early not only makes sense because we can improve mortality, but it also makes sense from an emotional point of view that late diagnosis is a horrific thing to have happen to you if you are the patient. Finally, in terms of surveillance and picking up cancers that have not yet developed, in other words, survey patients who are at risk, there is hope on the horizon. We must do more research into this. There are better biomarkers coming along. There are conditions which predispose to pancreatic cancer, such as IPMN, which is little cystic lesions in the pancreas that are being picked up increasingly on people who are having CT scans done for other reasons. We need to be able to monitor those patients in case they are at risk, and we need to identify other people who are at risk from family history, etc. So there is hope in every aspect, but it is still obviously a big challenge.
Funny enough, when we had the GPs, I think GPs raised an issue about CT scans and their ability to send people, and their kind of slight hesitance that if they send and then there's nothing there, and they send and there's nothing there, and that whole business of who decides what
You got a big shake of the head from Mike, and
Yeah.
a big nod from me.
Yeah.
GPs should absolutely be able to send people, but the reason why the shake of the head is because it's an expensive test and it causes radiation. Therefore, it has to be very, very carefully controlled. It has to be for very precise reasons, and it's about bringing together some of the ideas about support systems and decision tools together with the opportunity to do early CT scanning. So random CT scanning on people with vague symptoms, no. Targeted scanning on people who have got the right sort of symptoms without going to a specialist, yes.
I don't agree with...
Go on.
No,
This is the building to have disagreements in.
Yeah, I think that's the wrong model, and I think the problem does not lie at the GP level. I think the GPs personally are very good, and I think their problems are heavy. To deal with somebody that comes with very vague symptoms is difficult, and you need to know what to do. So let's take what actually happens to the patient, right? So, chap goes to his GP, says, look, I've got some vague pain, I've got a bit of weight. GP says, I'm not sure what it is, but I think it's something in the tummy. Fine, that's not a problem. I'll send you to see Mr. Bloggs, the tummy doctor.
Yeah.
So the patient turns up there, and probably Mr. Bloggs, the tummy doctor, is an expert in reflux disease. That's going to be a common scenario. And I think we hear this all the time from the patient. So put yourself in the patient's picture. You come along, you see the specialist with great expectation. He's going to solve my problem, tell me what I've got and fix me. So patient turns up and the chap says, well, it's not reflux, and I'm a reflux doctor, and I can tell you it's not reflux. Back to your GP. Right? So it goes back to the GP, more delay has come in, the GP says, well, it wasn't reflux. Maybe, now that you've got some back pain or something, we'll try the spine doctor. Because maybe it's spinal pain that's giving you, radiating through to the front or something like this. So he goes to the spine surgeon. Spine surgeon says, well, it's not spine pain, I can tell you that. Go back to your GP. I mean, this is the common scenario, what the patient is experiencing. The patient's become a tennis ball. Right? I think that's fundamentally wrong, and what needs to happen is what we need is more doctors with a big D that say, OK, Mr. So-and-so has come to me, his problem is now my problem. And I'm not going to let that problem go till I fix the problem. It may be that my main interest is reflux, but I'm going to get to the bottom of this problem and get that patient to the right person. And he has got access to all the hospital tools that he can deploy in one go. The GP, if you go to him with a CT scan, it's a negative scan. Where is he? Nowhere. Or even if it's a scan that shows something else completely, I don't know, a cyst in the adrenal, totally different tack. I think this is not good utilisation of resource, and I think the resource needs to be directed by somebody who's got access to the full tools, but will not let the problem go until it's solved. And that's the problem, is secondary care.
Well, that's an interesting point. Sophie, were you nodding, or which one do you support? Come on.
I can see both sides. I mean, for the patient, it's such a torturous journey. They are. There's such a scenario. They get bounced back. They keep getting told that actually everything's normal. And yet there they are with symptoms that are vague, but they've seen a specialist, so but it's just not the right specialist, and it goes. But obviously they get bounced back to the GP, because if in the hospital setting, if you see somebody and it's not reflux but it's something else, you haven't, unless you can target them to a different test, but you can't necessarily refer them straight to a different specialist.
Are we talking about a total restructuring again of the NHS, or what?
No, it's not NHS restructuring. It's the model of process that, and it's not a restructuring. It's actually having people who are, if you're in America, you would use the word internist, who are not necessarily people that are going to be subspecialists in the right toenail, but they know how to pick up a problem and deal with the problem, solve the problem. That's the doctor's job. The doctor is a problem-solving machine, and that's the bit that we've lost.
But you're asking for something bigger even than, presumably this affects people not just with pancreatic cancer, with everything else.
Correct.
On the nature of the system we have.
Exactly right. I think the disappointment of a patient turning up and hearing, well, it's not reflux, but I don't know what it is, back to your GP.
Yeah.
The disappointment in somebody's face when, I've gone to see the big specialist who's going to fix me. And then he says, no, back to your GP. And
the issue must be partly where you make the dividing line, isn't it? Because, I mean, the GP obviously isn't going to just send everybody to a person at the next level who's going to sort out what it is. So presumably the GP is saying, I mean, your example was he's saying it's a tummy problem and sending him to a tummy person. But that he's got to do something, hasn't he, the GP?
No, entirely. That's entirely appropriate.
But then the person that he gets referred to is a tummy specialist. But you're saying he or she ought also to have a much wider brief or
exactly.
to...
I think we're losing that bit in the secondary sector of secondary care sector where people were diagnosticians, right? And we replaced them with technicians. So we've gone from being doctors with a big D to doctors with a small d, aka technicians.
Yeah.
That is the problem.
First of all, I don't disagree with what you're saying. I think that is absolutely right in terms of identifying a process. You want a patient to go to a doctor who says, I'm going to worry until I've sorted you out. And that's what you want. My slight variance would be that I think if we had GPs in the room, they'd say, but I'm that person. I'm the person that comes to the GP. I look after you, and I'm going to look after you for the rest of your life. And I'm going to make sure that when you come to me with a problem, if I'm a good GP, I will worry until I've solved your problem. So I think we have to support the GPs in being that role. I don't think we can introduce the general physician again. Having said which, as a gastroenterologist who is referred patients constantly with a wide range of different conditions, I do take that role, and I think you're right. Every doctor should take that role, that they should take responsibility there. We need to change the culture a bit in the NHS, well, a lot actually, from a go-away culture to a come here and be sorted out by me culture.
And it's this definition, isn't it, of the nature of doctor, because we had evidence from some GPs and some patients, and some GPs had taken on that role. You know, they were determined to get to the bottom. But the other side of it, we had loads and loads of evidence, exactly what you're saying, Satvinder, of people backwards and forwards, and still no wiser till it was too damn late to do anything.
GP doesn't have access to the tools. That's the thing. The tools rest in the hospital setting. So you want that attitude of I'm going to fix this problem, where you've got access to all the tools. If the GPs, of course, are wonderful, you want them to look after their patients and worry about them and so on, of course that's right. But they don't have the speed of access to the tools that you will get if you're a consultant in a hospital.
Sounds like you're arguing in favour of giving GPs access to CT scanning.
No, because I think it would create the signal-to-noise ratio would be very high. It would create a lot of noise for very little signal. And I think that's not a good use of resource. And what you actually need is someone thinking rather than simply turning out request forms. And I think that is, as I said earlier, I think that little bit of diagnostician in the hospital setting is gone and used to be very strong.
To be fair, you know, from the poor British public's point of view, if you take me, who is not a specialist in any of this, you're all damn doctors to me.
Yeah.
That kind of, whoever you are, and I still see everyone as a doctor.
Yes. Yeah.
But it is quite a change of attitude, isn't it? Because I think most of us would think that the GP, as Andrew was saying, I think was the person who was going to be in overall charge of sorting my problem out.
Absolutely.
And so this is what I was saying about the dividing line. I mean, I think it's quite a fundamental change if we're actually seeing the GP. Well, I don't quite know how we would see the GP and quite how the relationship between the two would work. I'm a little confused about, you know, who I am now looking to solve my problem.
Well, the GP's role is very clear. He's sensed there's a problem, and what he wants to do, the GP, is get the patient to somebody who is going to solve the problem, right? And what's happening now is that the patient is coming back and saying, well, I've been to see your specialist, he hasn't solved my problem. So you're reintroducing the GP to now commit him to a third action, see the patient, refer him again. Right? So you're back actually to exactly where you were at the beginning. So you're going around a little loop, and you've got to break the loop. You've got to say that once you've been referred into the secondary system, you don't come out until the problem is fixed. Yeah. Now, that's not taking away any responsibility from the GP, because what the GP should be doing, and did do, and increasingly it's become less and less, is that 3 weeks have gone by, he'll pick up the phone to Mr. Bloggs and said, look, I sent you my chap to sort out his tummy problem. I haven't heard that you fixed the problem. What's going on? That's what the GP needs to be doing, not re-referring to another agent.
But there is assumption that the patient is seeing the same GP, and a lot of the time it's locums, they see different people, they can't get to see the same person.
All the more reason to have a single access, not repeated access. Because if the guy comes back to the GP and you say, OK, problem not solved, back to GP, it's GP number 2, the whole sequence starts again. This is where the madness has crept in.
But surely some of it's about competencies. If you're a GP who has got training in internal medicine, who has been trained to appropriately use CT scanning, then why shouldn't the GP have access to that under controlled circumstances?
How many of those are there?
I think there are.
Well, to be fair, I mean, we did see a couple of examples of, as I said, I can't remember the specifics of it, of GP who was doing that, and also in group practices, swapping notes about and discussing patients they were concerned about, and looking at dealing with it in that basis. But again, to be fair, on the other side, the tons and tons of written evidence and witnesses we've had is this backwards and forwards business.
In the end, I think it's always put yourself in the patient's place. What is the patient experience?
Yeah.
We can all have a chat about how wonderful we are, how great we think we're running the system. Put yourself in the shoes of the patient. What the patient wants is the doctor is sending me to a specialist. The specialist is not going to let me go till he's fixed my problem. That is what the patient wants.
Right.
He does not want to go back to his GP to have another discussion and say, the specialist didn't fix my problem, now what are you going to do? Doesn't want that.
Interesting point. No, get the point. Made us think. Angus, this business about early diagnosis and what's available, and you put some written evidence, and we've all read the newspapers on this Ted Andinker, or whatever, the American guy who solved everything.
Yes.
Apparently. Can you make some comment about that?
Well, we were discussing this too. I mean, they've claimed that it's very accurate, but for a test to be useful, it really does have to have the sensitivity and the specificity to warrant it to be used. And we can't find the evidence that that's actually being done. They've shown that it's a very good, that it will confirm pancreatic cancer. As its sensitivity, that you have to have trials to do that.
Right.
Because I was given an example of someone who said that they'd got a test for a rare disease and it was 50% accurate. Well, so spinning a coin. So it's got to be shown to be useful.
Yeah.
And that's not done yet, but I'm sure they're doing it because they awarded the fellow a big prize.
Yeah. Interesting. So nobody's got any evidence that this is being tested?
All of these things need to be properly researched. Yeah. The idea of giving GPs access to CT scanning, the idea of having an internist whose role is not to be a specialist but to be a diagnostician, the role of any new diagnostic test, the Q score, none of these things have been absolutely rigorously and properly researched clinically. That's what we need to do. When we bring in a new drug, when a drug company says, I want to give you this new drug, they won't get it anywhere near the market until they've got really solid evidence that it works. And yet we're constantly introducing things into the NHS which haven't been proven to work. And that's what we need to do. We need to research all of these things, CT scanning, new tests, etc.
Right. Angus, can you say a bit further? Because you've got in your written dealing with some of the drugs and where your research is going. Could you just comment about that?
Okay. The problem with treating pancreatic cancer, once it's not resectable, is that the options are very limited, and you basically have to look a little bit at the history. And until fairly recently, people tried big, heavy drug regimens that could get a bit of shrinkage, but they didn't last very long, and the survival was very poor. And then this mould was changed with the introduction of a drug called Gemcitabine, or Gemzar, which is still the sort of gold standard, as it were. And what was interesting about this drug, it changed the field in quite a way, because it didn't have much of a response rate, but the patients sort of survived it and their disease, and they lived a bit longer with better quality of life. And so that became accepted as the gold standard. Now, everybody has been doing, because it is still after a year, you're only going to have about 20% of people who started alive. Everyone's been looking for using this drug plus X. So there's been many drugs used together with gemcitabine, and some of them have led to improved survival. But the improved survival is very small at yet more toxicity, so guaranteed toxicity. So my role as an oncologist is very much to assess the patient as to what's appropriate for them. Would they take a heavier toxicity? Is it worth it over the standard one? As I mentioned from the research point of view, is that we started looking at a vaccine to boost the immune response for it, and because the pancreatic cancer is very immune suppressive, it keeps everything away until you sort of break that down and change the environment. It's going to be very hard to kill it, basically. So you really go for containment. That vaccine, just to give you an idea, we actually have one of the vaccines which with Satvinder we have actually got in the clinic in randomised trials for pancreatic cancer. And that has taken an enormous amount of basically private venture capital to get that in. And that leads me to the thing, there's several other things I would love to be able to do, and I used to be able to do as an academic, until the European Union Clinical Trials Directive came in, and which is pretty draconian. It's basically made academic research and things which aren't going to be profitable for drug companies incredibly difficult to do. Indeed, so difficult that we just don't bother. There are a number of things which I would love to do, and one of the things that my background is very much when I was in the immunology department as an oncologist at Northwick Park, I became aware of the tremendous power of thalidomide and had a crucial role in taking that to Celgene to get them to research it. And I declare an interest. They funded me for many years to work on it. And there's a little irony here with regards to relationships with companies, etc. We got the analogues, and the first of those is Revlimid, which is now approved and the gold standards for myeloma. I was very keen to put that into pancreatic cancer. As an academic, I could easily have done that. But now with the directive, and I think the overinterpretation, is you need an enormous amount of money to do any sort of clinical study. Whereas previously, as academics, we could do a doctor's and dentist's exemption, and we could tell within a dozen or 2 dozen patients whether a drug was worth continuing with or whether its toxicity outweighed, etc. Now, to do that simple process, you need hundreds of thousands, if not 1 or 2 million, I was quoted when I wanted to suggest something else in the clinic. The irony was, and I think I mentioned it there, I chaired a committee, a UK Pancreatic Cancer Expert Oncologist Committee, and we basically had up there was gemcitabine plus many other drugs for the ones which the X, which would be the best X. And it was fascinating. I just chaired, but off their own bats, they all said they would like to try the combination with thalidomide because of its anti-cancer activity. This was Celgene. Celgene had got the rights for thalidomide. They took all that advice and they are not pursuing it because they went and bought another drug called Braxane, and they're pushing that and have dropped taking thalidomide through because that's a very high-tech, expensive drug. And I'm afraid that's one of the issues we're dealing with. I think I would say, if I had nothing else here, I would desperately plead I would love to see the reinstigation of the freedom to do doctors and dentists exemption studies if we're going to take anything further forward, because everything's now completely ruled by the drug companies as to what is going to become a standard treatment or a potential candidate for that. And I think we're losing a lot of fairly simple, straightforward things that we could do and are never ever going to be tried in the current environment.
Was that, forgive me because I'm ignorant on this, was that for extra safety reasons? Was it the argument behind the European directive, or?
You ask a very pertinent question. That was the reason given.
Yeah.
I strongly suspect the real reason is that the big pharma didn't want small companies coming in with generics when their patent ran out, so they raised the barriers of entry. It's extremely high. And I think actually they've raised them so high, even they are a little bit frustrated at the costs that are incurred in getting some of these drugs to market.
Interesting.
And that leads, what you need to know, that leads to drugs and oncology, when I started in oncology, we did drugs that cost £40, £50, £100 a shot. We're now dealing with drugs that cost £5,000 a month. And in the case of one of my specialties, myeloma, but the new drugs cost £80,000 for one of the new ones that's been approved. Well, how can society afford that if we're going to have a high percentage of patients? So I think there's a real need to address this issue, because I think there are a lot of simpler, less toxic drugs out there for conditions that are never going to be used or investigated because of this over-interpretation of the Clinical Trials Directive.
It's really interesting. There's an interesting point. Has any other doctors got any comments on what he said?
Only to agree that getting any trial off the ground now is prohibitive in terms of cost.
Well, it's also just the time it takes as well. It's not just the cost. In order to do trials, you're involved in such intensive regulatory work and filling in multiple forms, sending them back. But every patient has a folder that thick. And doctors' time, these terrible consultants are being paid a hideous amount of money, and they were all being asked to do more and more clinical work. There's no time left to do the research work in a standard doctor's time, because the amount of time it takes to do a trial. We did one trial very recently, 5 patients to go through. I think the hospital earned £300 per patient. It took about 5 or 6 hours per patient. It's completely nonsensical to do it. We do it, but it doesn't make any sense for a doctor to get involved in trials unless that is purely the only thing they do.
It's interesting. As a politician, I have business people complain about health and safety rules. I didn't think I'd have doctors complaining about, but very interesting line, and we'll try and pursue that. Angus may need to get back to at some point and talk about that specifically. Can I just raise, and this is anecdotal stuff, because I was always told that in America there's more options of taking the pancreas out, and we don't do that. That wasn't the kind of anecdotal stuff. Any comments?
Well, I mean, I'm trained at Sloan Kettering, which is probably the premier cancer centre there, and there's nothing that they can do technically that we wouldn't do here better, quite frankly.
There are statistics that there is more surgery.
There is
more surgery.
There's more surgery, and I think probably part of that is that they're part of that for a variety of reasons, and we see that quite often here with patients seeking opinion in America. Is that their patient selection probably is not as rigorous as ours is. I think that's definitely true. And if you're in one of the big centres with pancreatic cancer, that's fine, because they will run a platform like we do with multidisciplinary teams and meetings and so on. But a lot of pancreatic surgery, even in America, is done in small hospitals where the patients will not be passed through that kind of rigorous scrutiny. So I think the scrutiny here in England, in the UK, is far, far greater than it is in the United States of who gets an operation. From a technical point of view, there's nothing that the US would be doing that we would not be able to do here, and as I said, probably better, given how we've restructured now delivery of pancreatic cancer surgery.
Can I ask 2 questions based on that? I mean, firstly, my understanding was that the survival rates are actually better in the States, so I mean that seems to be contrary to what you're suggesting. But the second question was exactly relating to this question of specialist centres, because I think one of the other things we've heard is that survival rates and outputs are better from specialist centres. What's the right direction for us to go in that area? I mean, how can we increase the number of patients who are actually going to places that are specialists in pancreatic cancer, as opposed to the smaller specialist ones?
There's two elements there, and I think there are many reasons why the results for pancreatic cancer survival in the US might be better, one of which is going to be access to drugs, for instance, like Gus is saying. I think that even now the geographic distribution of access to drugs across the UK is there's still a lot of geographic variability in that. You want to say anything on that, Gus?
I don't know quite if it's so much access to drugs, certainly to trials. One of the things I learnt from this chairing the committee of what is actually given in the UK was that the colleagues from up north basically said that over half their patients diagnosed with pancreatic cancer never get any treatment at all. because the implication was that they were too far gone and it would be inappropriate to offer them chemotherapy, etc. So I think that role comes into it with regards to access. So I think that the gold standard drugs are fairly accessible everywhere, and everybody get gemcitabine. It's really access to research to improve that outcome, which is really very variable. And I think we're all very frustrated. We're all looking for this X, the gemcitabine, etc. And a lot of people don't have access to studies doing that. That's how I would say the biggest access to drug issue is regards probably the clinical trials.
But that links to the question of specialist centres, then, doesn't it?
So, on the specialist training element, I think we're actually quite good now, and that's directly as a consequence of the reorganisation of pancreatic cancer surgery. When I was training, pancreatic cancer was done in some specialist centres and in a whole variety of district general hospitals where the surgeon was probably doing 1 or 2, maybe 5 a year. And if you look at there was a very nice publication looking at that data which quoted a variability in the mortality, for instance. John Neoptolemus published that in the BJS, a variability in the mortality of 28% at one end of the spectrum, down to sort of a few percent, depending on which type of hospital, essentially, which type of hospital you went to. And that's it was a well thought out. And these were people putting in data who claimed themselves to be pancreatic specialists. So this wasn't, randomly selected. It was, I'm a pancreatic specialist, yet the mortality had a range between sort of 1 or 2 up to 28%. So I think the reorganisation of pancreatic surgery into regional centres has done a great deal, not only for the patient, but also for surgical training. One of the reasons I went abroad, and I went first to the States, to Sloan Kettering, and then to Japan, was that in my time, that level of specialist training in the areas that I was interested in was not available in this country. And I took very much the view, well, I want to be an expert in the pancreas and cancer and so on, so I'll find out who is the best on the planet and I'll go there, because we didn't have that kind of structure in the UK to provide that training. I think that's changed, and that does sidetrack me onto another subject, educating the future generation of surgeons, but that's not what we're here to discuss.
Right. Andrew, you want to comment?
The whole role of centralising services and how we structure the pathway is my job as HPP Pathway Director for London Cancer. So that's a central question which we ask ourselves, is about how much should be centralised and how much benefit to the patients can you accrue from centralisation. There is absolutely no doubt, and there's a huge amount of data to support it, that surgeons doing a small number of cases a year are likely, but not definitely, but likely to have poor outcomes. There are quite a lot of surgeons who actually have got very low numbers, who have amazingly good rates, and therefore it doesn't absolutely equate that if you're only doing a few a year, you're going to be a bad surgeon with bad outcomes. But there is no doubt that it is right that there should be a fair number of being done in a specialist centre in order to achieve good results. Whether that line continues to go on going up, the more numbers you do in any centre, is not something that's been answered by research questions. So one of the questions we're asking ourselves is, should the Royal London and the Royal Free Hospital services be combined onto one site in order to have greater numbers? They both have very good results and they're both very good centres. What we are going to be doing, initially at least, is to be combining them into one faculty, because what we do know is that people working together in a team will work better, there will be more sharing of information, there will be sharing of research output, and there will be, as you rightly point out, better opportunities for education, which is absolutely vital in training up the next generation of surgeons to do the work. Whether we should be combining them onto one site faces a whole range of other questions. You have to look at the physical availability of space. In the United Kingdom, we can't just keep putting up another building next to another hospital as you can in Sloan Kettering. You can just build another hospital because it's a fee-for-service. They get a whole lot more money for doing more surgery, therefore it makes financial sense to do the work. And that also, I'm afraid, explains a little bit why there's more surgery in America as well. If you're paid to do something, you tend to do it. If you're paid to do it right, and you're paid to just be in post to do something, maybe you tend to do it more for the right patient than all the time. But that's perhaps another question. But in terms of centralising services, it is right to centralise them, but one has to be careful not to impact on on other services that are going on in the hospital. One has to be careful that in a place like London, you're not making patients travel a huge distance to very expensive parts of London for their specialist surgery, which may give them some slightly better outcome, but in exchange for having to travel 30 miles with expensive accommodation rates, terrible parking abilities, etc. Those things need to be taken into account when considering this centralisation issue.
Sophie, did you want?
Well, I think certainly from the patient's practical point of view, specialised centres, we have a lot of patients who come out of county to us, and the practicalities of getting them there, their relatives, the follow-up, that sort of thing, they're doing often sort of 100-mile round trips, if not more. If it's not winter and snowy, then it's the cost of the, and it's from that point of view, they're not happy to come and see us. Although from the point of view of wanting somebody who knows how to do the surgery and knows all about the condition, that's that's a different. It's not the day-to-day practicalities for them. But,